Today, Australia's economy is worse than you think. Hi again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics World. Now, this post covering finance and property news. It's Friday, and Tarric is back for another conversation about charts, the economy, and, well, the world in general. Tarric, welcome back.
Thanks, mate. It's great to be here. There's certainly a lot to talk about, and well, I feel like not a day can go past without there being some sort of calamity or development that is worthy of our discussion.
Yeah, I think we should make these podcasts a lot more frequent and longer because there's so much to talk about. We had the Freedom of Information release about what the RBA's modelling is doing, which was quite fascinating and didn't get a lot of coverage, but that was quite important. And then, of course, we had some more economic indicators which suggested that maybe inflation is rearing its head again. And of course, people started thinking, well, maybe the Reserve Bank won't cut rates as much as people thought. And then, of course, Michelle Bullock came out and said, well, yeah, inflation's a bit hot. And then, of course, we've got the government messing around with, trying to work out where to spend and how not to spend, and ramping up the debt even more. The migration question still bubbling away. I haven't even started yet. Not least, of course, the US with their stronger economic data, and the jobs data was better than people expected, despite the fact the Fed cut. Oh dear, you can't make this stuff up, really, can you?
No, it's kind of funny. It feels like that it's only been, I think, 3 weeks since we last had a chat, and I feel like it feels like more like 3 years. Just there's so much going on. I mean, even just here politically, you've got the sort of rumblings over the future of the leadership of the Liberal Party. What exactly is going to be the stance of the Liberal Party on migration? And well, not only that, but if they start messing with migration, what then is their stance going to be on things like housing? Because it's going to be very difficult to try and support the housing market without migration at elevated levels.
Yes, and it is fascinating to me that the migration question is still bubbling away. But to my mind, a lot of people haven't really understood and joined the dots between, demand, not just for property, but for services, more people wanting to go to see the doctor, hospitals, driving around. So it's creating huge pressures. So unlike in the 50s and 60s, where there was strong migration, strong house building, and strong infrastructure investment, what we've got at the moment is strong migration and not a lot else, really.
That's a good point, because you look back at, say, for example, public investment, and you factor in all the various ways that public investment used to feed into the economy. So that's publicly owned corporations, through the states, through the local councils, you name it, just public investment in general. That back in, for most of the period between the sort of 1950s and the 1970s, even to a degree the early 1980s, that averaged somewhere between around about 7 and 10% of GDP, generally towards the upper end of that particular sort of range. Today, despite the fact that we have this absolutely huge level of migration in recent years, and despite the fact that infrastructure today relative to GDP is a lot more expensive than it used to be, it's only about 5% of GDP. So we aren't seeing that investment in public infrastructure that we need to in order to be able to keep up with this huge population growth. And that's despite the fact that many of us are going to be paying more for our services, things like water. Sydney Water came out recently, said bills are going to go up by more than a third in order to, you guessed it, prepare the infrastructure for more demand. So it's rather incompatible with some of the rhetoric coming from the political class that everything is fine and we can totally take this and afford it, when in actual fact the costs are being put onto households, both in the form of higher bills and also just lesser quality services and more congested infrastructure.
Yeah, and there's some really fascinating information out of the most recent Hilda surveys. Now, I'm always skeptical of Hilda because, of course, it's 2 to 3 years old before it actually comes out. And it doesn't necessarily represent the true story because they underrepresent the impact of migration on their survey base because of the methodology. They actually admit that in the most recent report. But there were two takeouts. One was that households are today paying an ever higher proportion of their income in tax than ever before, and you can see the trend growing over time. The other is that the disposable income is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of households, and which is a nice segue into your slides actually, because that's where you start the conversation too about the fact that households, working adults in particular, well, they're under the gun.
As usual, the charts will be available at burnouteconomics.com. The link will be in the description. And any subscribers support that you wish to provide, that is always very, very much appreciated, as are your messages and DMs of support. So for that, I say thank you very much, and we'll get straight into it. Now, in understanding economic data, there are sort of levels that you go through in terms of granularity that give you a greater and greater level of clarity of what's actually going on. Now, don't get me wrong, getting actual genuine clarity at a household level is very, very difficult. But what you can do is work your way down through those layers, and you get a better and better and better read on things. Now, you start with, say, headline GDP, you work your way to GDP per capita, and then living standards, as it's generally expressed in the media and by economists here in Australia, is real household disposable income per capita. But there's a problem with that, because it doesn't take into account how the composition of the population changes over time. Because what it basically is all household disposable income deflated by inflation and then divided by the total population. But obviously, a large proportion of the population are children. And children, and when I say children, I'm referring to people under working age, so under the age of 15. They're very unlikely to have an income, and if they do have an income, it's likely to be relatively minimal. So as the proportion of the population held by children declines, the level of real household disposable income should rise, because you're replacing children who don't have an income with an adult who does have an income. So what I did to sort of try and get through this demographic distortion is not divide total real household disposable income by the entire population, but solely by the working age population, which is defined as people aged 15 and over. And what that reveals is that between the middle of 2012 and the latest data, households have basically gone nowhere once you have adjusted for this particular distortion, which is, I think, really quite striking, because we are told that the current economic strategy is successful, that, high migration is our special sauce, yet in the post-mining boom era, with the exception of the distortions created by the pandemic, which were temporary, we haven't actually seen the strong, robust growth that you would associate with economic success.
No, and the other point, of course, is that's an average of all adults, right? But the distribution is the other thing, and that earlier cartoon slide with the K shape highlights the other point, that in fact, if you look carefully, there are some household groups who've done extremely well and whose incomes are actually a lot stronger, adjusted for inflation, than they were. But around 2/3 of households are on the other side of the equation. So in other words, the average is low, but actually for those in that second cohort I discussed, they've actually gone way backwards. And there's a strong correlation between, for example, those in the rental sector and income pressure, or those with the mortgage problem and household affordability problems and their incomes. So the story that you've never had it so good, et cetera, or whatever you want to put on the table as some way of the politicians spinning that we're doing well, belays the true facts. When you actually think about it and look at the data, no, we've gone backwards for many people. In real terms, gone nowhere, and costs of everything, of course, have gone up a lot.
Exactly, and I think the thing is that this is not the only factor that is driving real household disposable income where it should be getting pushed higher. So, for example, since that point in 2012, which I've used as the point of departure here, in the middle of 2012, I've done a counterfactual, right? And what this has basically done is, over time, there have been a greater and greater proportion of Australians of working age who have been in the labour force, and in particular working. So what that dotted line there represents is what real household disposable income per working age adult would have looked like if the only thing acting on it was just the fact that there was a higher proportion of people of working age who were employed. So really, we are lagging fairly significantly where we should be, just based on the fact that there are more Australians in the workforce today as a proportion of the population than there was those 13 years ago. It's also worth noting that that isn't the only factor either. There are other factors which should be pushing up this metric. For example, on average, the population is slightly older. The average person is slightly further into their career, which means they should, at the average, be earning a higher level of real household disposable income. But at the average, they're not. There's also the fact that there is a cohort of retirees who have passed away who have generally been much less affluent than the current crop of retirees that are feeding through into the system, which should also be pushing up real household disposable income per capita, but isn't. So there's all these factors of people who should be getting ahead but aren't. But as you say, there's also the granular side of things where there are people who are very much getting ahead while a whole lot of other people are, in real terms, falling behind.
And just a definitional question: when you talk about real household disposable income, is that after tax?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
After this is as real household disposable income is measured by the national accounts, which is after tax and after household interest repayments. So, while it is somewhat impacted by the overall, but by the issue of higher interest rates, it's also impacted on the other side of the coin by higher deposit rates. So the actual impact of I did this analysis a few weeks ago. The actual impact in terms of the positive impact of rate cuts on real household disposable income is about it's less than 0.1% of GDP. I think it was about 0.06% of GDP has been the positive impact of rate cuts thus far, which really isn't all that much. And it's also just worth noting that this particular metric is based on headline inflation, which has been distorted by the electricity subsidies, which we're now starting to see unwind. I mean, you may have the chart from the ABS, Martin, of the 24.6% increase in year-on-year in electricity prices. Now that particular increase isn't included in this data because it postdates this data, and that will, as the electricity subsidies end and base effects start impacting the CPI, will actually put downward pressure on real household disposable income per working age adult, which could, and it's well within the realm of possibility, actually see it fall again. So just, some sort of interesting side notes there.
Yeah, and 2 points. The first is that the latest inflation numbers, which came out this week, which is only monthly, were actually quite a lot stronger than many people expected. And immediately, some of the market analysts reduced their expectation of further rate cuts. The truth is, of course, that those electricity subsidies effectively moved the inflation problem down, which allowed the government to position themselves better for the last election than it otherwise would have been. Surprise, surprise, surprise! Magic. You just move it down beyond the election, and suddenly, you still got to pay. And then the other point, of course, is that with this sort of information, the impact of migration, the impact of higher taxes, the impact of all of those other mechanisms are all sort of flooding in. And that's why some of this modeling gets quite complicated. But the truth is, when you talk to real ordinary Australians, as I do in the surveys, they know that it's tougher than it was, a lot tougher than it was, and so they call the politicians out when they say no, everything's good, wages growth is much stronger now, yeah, everything's good. The Michelle Bullock saying, "Oh, we expect households to start spending some more." There's a gap. There's a big gap between the political spin or even the RBA spin and reality on the ground. And I actually think that more and more people are beginning to say, "Hang on a moment, this isn't working for us."
No, I thoroughly agree. And I think that that is really where we're at as an economy, because we've got the RBA, we've got the government saying, oh, the private sector's going to, take the baton, the private sector's going to bounce, blah, 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 blah. And perhaps that will be true. I don't think we can say unequivocally one way or another. But I think that the early evidence from things like the labor market suggests that that pathway out of the government reliant economy that we have really sort of found ourselves entrenched in over the last couple of years in particular, is going to be quite a lot more challenging than the RBA governor and some of the sort of bullish bank commentary would suggest.
Well, that takes us quite nicely into the non-market versus market conversation, right? When, of course, the government stoked the jobs market in the public sector very strongly in recent times, to the point where non-market jobs is where all the action has been. But they can't go on doing that because that costs. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the deficit's are so big. And in fact, your next slide gets rather nicely into that particular issue.
It does indeed. Now, what we saw in around about the third quarter of 2023 is market-based jobs growth really started to stall out. Now, market-based jobs are basically jobs in all industries, with the exception of public administration, education, and healthcare and social assistance. Now, as you can see there, the market-based jobs very much stalled out around that time, and has since somewhat recovered, but is still relatively anemic, all things considered. Meanwhile, non-market jobs rocketed. You saw a lot of, government-supported jobs, things like the NDIS, things like state-based public service jobs, etc., all played a major role in supporting jobs growth throughout 2023 and into 2024. But late in 2024, non-market jobs growth began to stall. And that is when we've started to see this rise in unemployment. Now, I believe it was Alex Joyner at IFM recently who said that basically if the participation rate had remained the same, unemployment would be about 4.44% at the moment instead of 4.24%, which would be already a fairly hefty clip above the RBA's target for the middle of 2027, which basically says unemployment will peak at 4.3%. So I think that there's a fairly hefty chance here that we could see unemployment push above the RBA's target. And if I think we get significantly above the target, particularly if it starts to really take off, I think we could start to see some panic cuts from the RBA.
Very interesting. And I guess the question that you got to ask yourself is, the problem with the non-market jobs is that it puts ever greater weight on the government, either state or federal, to continue to pay. And that's one of the reasons why the debt levels are so high. Victoria, of course, is probably one of the worst states at the moment in terms of what's going on for all sorts of reasons. But the question is, rate cuts from the RBA won't necessarily create momentum in the private sector. Private investment is very low at the moment. And in a time of uncertainty, firms tend to hold on to workers initially, but don't stop recruiting new workers. But if things go on, then the working population question comes, well, I've got to lose a few more people. And we've seen a few examples, from the banks, for example, starting to announce job cuts at the moment and saying, well, AI is going to do some of the work for us, and some other sectors too. So the job story ahead, I think, is one to watch. It's not necessarily going to be that positive. And I'm not sure that rate cuts and maybe, one or two more rate cuts are coming, is going to be enough of a catalyst to really turn the ship around.
I think the problem is that rate cuts, as we traditionally understand them, from when I say traditionally understand them, I mean from a textbook perspective. Rate cuts are ostensibly the main avenue of boosting an economy isn't actually meant to be through the mechanical impact of cash flows to households. That's part of it. But the main impact is meant to be through incentivizing business investment. Yet that isn't how it works in Australia, and that's not how it's worked for a very long time. Now, don't get me wrong, we saw a boost to business investment during the pandemic, but I think that has a lot more to do with the, sort of $500 billion worth of combined stimulus by the RBA and the various levels of government. But in terms of the actual impact of driving business investment, driving private sector investment, it doesn't really work the way that it's meant to, and it hasn't. Basically, I would say probably since at best the early to mid 2000s. So we're really in a position where the main impact rate cuts have is through the wealth effect, is through boosting asset prices, in particular property prices. So that is really the means by which we are, by which the RBA can boost the economy, particularly as we've discussed before, because we are seeing that larger pool of savings that households have. So the actual mechanical impact of on households is lower than it used to be because of the fact that households have bigger savings and are now getting less on those deposits. So I think we are very much a nation here reliant on the housing market firing, on asset prices, rising, and that's supporting consumption growth, and by extension, the economy, rather than a more traditional reliance on business investment pulling us out of this particular hole.
I think that's a great point, Tarric, and that I think explains why the enhanced first-time buyer support programs were brought forward to October 1. 5% deposit, 15% support available from the government, effectively supporting the LMI, so lower costs. And, the only game in town is stoke them prices.
Exactly. And I think the thing is that it's just worth noting that we've reached a point now where basically organic entry into the property market is becoming an endangered species in terms of new entrants. You've got, on one hand, you've got the government. Housing Australia talked up a report a while back where basically they said up to 40% of new market entrants received some form of federal assistance to get into the market. Now, with Albo's scheme, I suspect that particular proportion is going to get even higher. And then, as you've covered, for many years now with your data, you've got up to, what was the peak in your data for the number of people receiving assistance from the Bank of Mum and Dad?
Well, it's well north of 50%, in some cases closer to 60%, depending on definition of support. And the average amount is rising. It's well over the 120, 130,000 now. And in Sydney, it's even higher because, of course, prices are higher. So you're right. There's a smaller, shrinking proportion of people who can find their own way into the housing market unless they've got support from either the government and or the Bank of Mum. And by the way, I'd make the point that in my surveys, there are people waiting for 1 October to come to be able to go get that property and also use the Bank of Mum and Dad as well, and use some of the state supports as well. So when you actually pile all of these elements up, you realize that there are people out there saying, okay, I'm going to buy because, I've got all of these handouts from these various sources. Great for those who can. But bear in mind, of course, also the Productivity Commission always says, well, remember, this is a mechanism to help the sellers of property rather than the buyers of property. It's not going to solve housing affordability because the people who can't get into the market still can't get into the market. It mostly impacts those who would have already been able to get into the market at some point, bring it forward slightly. So it doesn't really solve fundamental housing affordability, but it does solve the government's problem of trying to create more momentum in the economy, stamp duty, and also the wealth effect property prices going up, which is the only game in town. So you can see directly through this why they're doing it and the implications, but it's not actually going to solve the housing affordability problem. It's just going to stoke the prices higher. And it's interesting to note the latest ABS data for the last quarterly lending statistics. They do it quarterly now, unfortunately. The average across Australia, the average first-time buyer loan is now $550,000, and that's the highest it's ever been. It's tracking quite a lot higher. And of course, it's a lot higher in Sydney relative to some other places. So it's a mess. But the government is putting all of its eggs in the property basket again.
Yeah, I was just wondering, have you sort of done like research over time as to what proportion of first home buyers are receiving both assistance from their parents or from family and some form of assistance from the federal government? Is that a data set that you have, or?
The answer is yes, and about 2/3 of those who get the first-time buyer grant is getting some other form of help as well.
Wow, you'll have to send that to me. I would love to get into detail on that.
I'll look that data out, and it's been growing. So if you go back, there was a big peak through the COVID period with Home Builder and all that sort of stuff. But if you go back into the previous generation, it tended to be either or. You got a bit of help from bank and mum and dad, or you got help from. But now everybody grabs whatever there's because of course the states say, well, help yourself, and then the government's saying, well, help yourself. First time buyer, yeah, welcome, come all. And 5%. Just remember, folks, 5% is not a very big buffer. And if prices did wobble or go down at some point, and there's still a risk of that, then there's a bit of a negative equity problem. But of course, the negative equity problem initially is going to be held by the government, i.e., we the taxpayer. So we the taxpayer are effectively helping to prop up the property market. Don't you feel good about that, Tarric?
Well, I think it's kind of strange actually, because I've always thought, sort of do the right thing, build a deposit, have a buffer. But it turns out that despite my best efforts and the best efforts of lots of people who are aspiring home buyers, we could end up in a situation where the government makes such a mess of things, we're actually paying for being in negative equity without ever actually having a mortgage.
I know. What a privilege.
Just, they always say it's such a privilege to be an Australian. And yeah, in 2025, it certainly is.
Yeah. And it comes back to the fundamental problem, which is that the housing engine is the only game in town at the moment from the government. You can see it quite clearly, but it doesn't solve any of the fundamental structural issues. And if we move to another angle on this and think about the population growth, right? And just remember, folks, the population growth in Australia is quite a lot stronger than most other places.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this articulates the part of the sort of real world issue with that level of population growth quite nicely. Now, what this charts is the level of jobs growth for stable unemployment starting in January this year. And what we've got there in the red is the actual number of jobs that we've actually managed to grow within the economy. So basically, we're not keeping up with the level of population growth, the level of jobs growth that we need in order to keep up with the level of population growth, which is resulting in higher unemployment. And if not for that fall in the participation rate, we would be seeing significantly higher unemployment. And if this trend continues, well, I don't really want to say exactly how quickly this could go quite badly.
No, and it's interesting, I mentioned earlier on the Freedom of Information request where the RBA disclosed some of the charts they didn't put into their statement of monetary policy last time around. And it's interesting that they have reduced their theoretical neutral interest rate down a little bit, actually quite a lot. It depends on a few sensitive issues. Basically, they said, well, we got to actually maybe adjust pre-COVID and what have you, right? But the other interesting one was that the narrow, in other words, what is the rate of employment that is actually neither adding nor subtracting, went up. So their latest modeling is sort of, again, pulling in a couple of different directions, which I thought was quite fascinating. Yeah, and I've got the detailed information now. So the RBA's model showed in March that the neutral rate was 2.9% in the middle of 2024. That's about 0.7 percentage points lower than its previous estimate of 3.6%. So that's sort of the neutral interest rate. And with regard to this wonderful thing, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NARO, has climbed to 4.83% in the first quarter from 4.69%. And then they said, well, actually, there are various other separate studies using other labour market indicators that suggest an aggregate NARO of around 4.3 to 4.4%, which possibly is slightly lower than the RBA's working assumption of 4.5%. So all over the place. Enough to make the point that they're a bit caught, because on one hand, they may be saying, well, the neutral rate is down a bit, but the narrow is up a bit. So, and I come back to these technocrats playing with their models and trying to sort of mess with all of these different variables, and they produce all of these wonderful charts that are completely meaningless. And I'm thinking, what world are they in? Don't they understand what's going on down on the ground in real people household land?
You know what? I mean, obviously the answer is no. But I think one of the things that's really interesting is how can they know? You know, like when you really think about the sort of challenge that the RBA has faced now, you know, like you and I both give the RBA a fair bit of curry, you know, for their mistakes, and they have made a lot of fairly big mistakes. You know, no rate cuts for years and sorry, no rate rises for years to come, and all that sort of nonsense commentary. But I do feel for them in terms of their ability to actually accurately forecast the future because one, it's hard, but two, they don't know what the government's going to do. They don't know, like, you know, they could have sat back at the start of 2022 and been like, okay, inflation's going to be this, unemployment's going to be that, and we'll figure it out. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, net overseas migration just come in at like 400% what it was meant to for the second quarter of 2022. Now what do we do? You know, this blows our unemployment forecast to bits. And I think that's one of the major problems for the RBA going forward because we are seeing that reacceleration in population growth. You're seeing it in the national accounts. You're seeing it in the working age population inside the labour force survey, and when we're also seeing it within the admittedly now rather controversial net long-term and permanent arrivals data from the ABS. Now, none of those are gospel, don't get me wrong, but there is that evidence that to suggest that migration may be reaccelerating, which means that we're going to need more jobs created for the unemployment rate to stay stable, not less. And that could really complicate matters for the RBA, and that could push up unemployment quite a bit faster than they would like.
So I agree with you that the truth is that their theoretical model cannot model reality. And they've been very bad at making good predictions about what's going to happen because, of course, it's there are so many variables. But what I find fascinating is how so many of the economists sort of hang on the every word from the RBA and go into deep dives and all of this as though somehow the RBA is a perfect oracle of truth. And it reminds me of the old prophets, that they come down off the mountain with their stone tablets and saying, oh, we've got the answer. Well, no, actually, they are just muddling along like everybody else. And I think last time I sort of commented on this earlier in the week, actually, I made the point that they're, as much in the dark as we are really with what's going on. And not least because, of course, it's complicated internationally speaking as well as locally. But the net takeout of all of this was the expectation potentially of lower interest rates ahead may be questioned. In fact, a couple of the recent analysts have now said, well, maybe then we're not going to see a rate below 3.6% for any time soon, which again, of course, creates another problem for people. So yeah, it's complicated, folks, but don't necessarily take what the RBA says as gospel because they're muddling along just as much as anybody else.
Exactly. And I think there's also just the issue of the internal politics of the RBA. which is admittedly something that isn't terribly well understood. One day it will be. I think it'd be nice when that book is finally written. But unfortunately, we can't talk too much about that as it stands today. But then there's also the political pressure
Yeah.
on the RBA as well. So there are those issues, I think, and I think that if we do start to see unemployment pick up, the pressure on the RBA to cut, regardless of what's happening with inflation, is going to be huge. And I think we could see a fairly hefty blow up between the government and the RBA over cuts to rates if unemployment does begin to surge uncomfortably higher.
Well, and of course, the question there is: has the government stacked the board in, the monetary policy decision board, and are there people who are more politically aligned with what the government is trying to do rather than actually the economic technocrats from the RBA? And that will be an interesting thing to look at. I also say that one of the problems with the RBA, of course, is that they've been trying to be more transparent about what's been going on and disclose more. In a way, the more they try and disclose more and tell people about what they're thinking, the more people can see the emperor has no clothes.
Well, to be completely fair to them, it's not something that's unique to the RBA. The Fed is having the same problems, and I think in a lot of ways that it just goes to show just sort of how broken the system is. That we're sort of relying on they're relying on all these different indicators, all these different models to tell them what to do, what the future looks like. But I think part of the thing is that it doesn't really adequately account for both human nature, which is admittedly an absolutely huge and difficult thing to confront, but also the just increasingly interventionist ways of government more broadly. The old, the burnout economics, strategy from government of just them doing whatever the hell they like for political reasons, while the RBA or the Fed or the Bank of England or whoever tries to slam their foot on the brake, and the government's like, no, 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 we're just doing what we like. You're throwing electricity subsidies at things, we're throwing cash and money at whatever. We're creating all these various non-market jobs. We don't care because we want things to look good for political reasons. And as long as things are compromised in that way, it makes the job of the RBA and central banks more broadly very, very difficult. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's an unenviable position, but it's an unenviable position with a rather nice pay packet.
And now accountability.
Well, yeah, that too. I mean, who wouldn't want that job?
That's really the point. And I come back again and again to, I understand the rationale of separating the monetary decisions from the political environment to an extent. But when you actually understand how it all works, there is political influence, not least because, of course, treasurers sitting around the table as part of the decision process, but also because, by definition, the RBA is there partly to support the funding of the government, and partly, of course, to make sure that there's a coherent story about what's going on, even if the story isn't really coherent when you actually pick it apart. So, to my mind, it's an interesting role, more a work of fiction than economics, I think, and maybe that's how we should be reading what they come out with. It's an interesting theoretical model about the way the model works and the way the economy works. It's called Martin, by the way. It's quite funny, isn't it? And the fact of the matter is that it has huge impact on real people, because real people are actually trying to work out what to do and get by. But the amount of stuff written about it and all of the opining that we see, it's more heat than light. And maybe one way to reduce pollution is to reduce the amount of heat and light produced from all of these economists talking about these numbers when they come out. Maybe we should save a bit there, and we'd be better off.
Well, I mean, I guess that's one way of single-handedly achieving the 62% emissions target by 2035.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to find some way of doing it. Now, we touched on population, but you've got this next chart, which I think is absolutely fascinating with regards to the comparison between the population growth in Australia and the advanced economies, and something doesn't look right.
Yeah, it's really quite amazing because, there's this sort of narrative that runs through the Australian political discourse that Our immigration levels are normal. Our population growth levels are normal, and the simple reality is that that's not true. Now, this was put together by in one of the chart packs from IFM investors, but I've done my own charts going back, decades and decades, and basically what it shows is that developed world migration runs at somewhere around about zero point 0.4 to 0.5%. Now, this is population growth overall, but yeah, but that's roughly where advanced economies sit. Now, it's worth noting that part of the recent surge in population growth for advanced economies, because of the fact that that does include the Eurozone and the UK, has also just been due to the war in Ukraine. So that is a factor. And now that that issue is becoming, we are seeing, significantly reduced refugee flows from Ukraine, we're now starting to see that population growth fall back somewhat. So it's just really quite striking that there's this narrative that things are perfectly normal in Australia, but if you take a stance of reducing Australia's migration in per capita terms to develop world norms, you can get called some rather unkind things by quite a lot of people, even though you're just advocating what is normal in literally the rest of the developed world.
Well, it's become so politicized as an issue, hasn't it? And anybody who's talking about highlighting the migration question is immediately put in the in the R category. But the truth is, and I fundamentally believe a lot of people have turned out over the last few weekends to sort of make a fuss about it, are actually motivated by real, genuine concerns about the future of the country, because it's not a racist discussion. It's simply about an economic discussion when, in fact, the government is not investing sufficient in the infrastructures we discussed earlier on, where effectively we know that household disposable income is sideways or worse for many people. Housing affordability is shot, and government debt is rising, which means that more tax is being demanded. And by the way, also, of course, we've got the government. We're talking about digital IDs and talking about controlling the message over social media. So you've got a whole bunch of sort of threads to this, and I think people are just saying, "Hang on a moment, it's not working for us. We need to find a way of just highlighting the fact that we're concerned about what's going on." And I do believe it's a much broader concern rather than the very small minority who are actually there to just to create a fuss and to create to mayhem. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing is the politicians are dismissing it all, saying, those people are just neo-Nazis or whatever, and we don't need to take it seriously. I mean, I think there's a really serious issue here.
I concur, and I think that there needs to be a reframing of this issue, because it's all well and good for people to say, "Oh, well, Australia's normal." I don't think that the onus is on the people trying to say that we need lower migration to prove their point. Now, don't get me wrong. There are people, say like Leith Van Onselen at Macro Business and all manner of other people doing great data work on this, proving why this is such a huge issue. There's even some good papers from government agencies proving that the migration intake is far too large and we have a growing housing shortage. But realistically, if we are such a departure from the norm, which the chart very much illustrates, the onus should be on those who want to depart from the norm to justify their position, to justify why they think Australia needs to be big, why we need to have a migration intake that's almost 3 times the size of the developed world average. I think that is where the discussion needs to be taken, because realistically, if you sort of average out the developed world norm, or you even sort of average out the Australian norm up to sort of the pre-Big Australia era, they both arrive at a relatively similar area of somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6 of the population coming from migration. Now, if you were to then magically impose that on Australia at roughly an average level, it's a migration intake of about 135,000, which is something that Cameron Murray has also covered in his work, which puts that right in the butter zone of roughly what you want in terms of the maximum possible impact, the maximum possible positive impact on demographics. And if you do it right, you get the workers that you need. The problem is, by the government's own admission, the Assistant Immigration Minister, the former Home Affairs Minister, our system is broken and it's poorly targeted. And I have seen absolutely no major meaningful moves to actually address that, despite the fact that you're literally talking about a speech delivered by Claire O'Neill, the then Home Affairs Minister, talking about the severe issues with the migration system and the rising number of temporary visa holders. Irony there. Over 2.5 years ago. So I just think that's rather funny.
I agree. And interestingly, there's a similar discussion going on in the UK at the moment. And in fact, Starmer is now talking about bringing a digital ID system in the UK, mandatory digital ID system, which you have to be able to show digital ID to work because he thinks a lot of people are going into the black economy in the UK. But the most interesting statistic came out recently to show that there was a very high proportion of migrants coming in who were not workers. And what that means is they bring in families or relatives, etc., etc. And the statistic was so shocking that people sort of recoiled in horror to think just how many people were coming in, basically putting more pressure on the infrastructure and the healthcare system in the UK, but not necessarily bringing in more momentum in terms of helping with the economy. And interestingly, the analysis also showed that a lot of people who were coming in and were official migrants were actually also working in jobs, and they were being paid well below the average on those jobs. So the migration story in the UK is a combination of a lot of non-working people coming in and a lot of people coming in as cheap cannon fodder for the labour market. And I suspect that something similar is happening in Australia, but actually the data sets in Australia are pretty weak when it comes to trying to understand the composition of some of those things.
Well, I mean, there is the data from the University of Melbourne, which took a fairly sizable survey of the workforce of people aged 18 to 30, and it found that a third were being underpaid by 40% or more. Now, I think that is emblematic of a exploited underclass of people. Now, that exploited underclass is so large that it can't only be people on visas. There has to also just be regular people as well being caught up in that too. But it is just an absolutely enormous number of people. You're talking, well over 1 million people in that age cohort potentially being exploited, and I think that's just emblematic of just the issues that we face, that there's all these problems and there's no real appetite. I mean, if you said to someone, 30 years ago, a third of people are being exploited who are workers aged 18 to 30, it would have been a national scandal. But today it's just the cost of doing business. It's just the way things are. And I think it's just emblematic of just how far we've fallen in terms of just accepting just the challenging consequences of the choices made by our leaders. And just on the topic of Britain, Britain should be a very, very concerning cautionary tale for Australians, because the British consensus on migration, whatever of it existed, has been utterly destroyed. There are some polls in the UK now where a majority of respondents with an opinion believe that a sizable proportion of more recent migrants, including legal migrants, should be deported. That is a deeply concerning trend. And Australians just look around. Well, we're the multicultural success story. That would never happen here. No, the thing that insulates Australia from those sorts of thoughts and political extremism is the fact that we have been lucky. It's luck. It's the fact that we've had, governments blessed with resources, export revenue to the tune of almost $500 billion a year in some years, falling out of the sky, giving them the ability to paper over every little crack in the economy. Well, not every little crack, but enough cracks in the economy to be able to maintain the cohesion that they need to do what they're doing. But when things get challenging, people are going to, we are going to end up like on that pathway to Britain. At what pace, I'm not, I can't say, but we are on that pathway, and because of the mistakes made by the government. And I think the thing is that, Australians, I think, are conceptually okay with the idea of migration if it's done at the right level. If it's done at a level that benefits everyone, the migrants and the existing populace. And I think for the vast majority of Australia's history, that was true. But it hasn't been true in quite a while. And I think that initial chart with, the working age population disposable income is, emblematic of that. You know, we haven't seen the system work for everyday Australians since the end of the mining boom.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that in the UK, the term modern day slavery has really started to find its way into the conversation. In other words, people are actually working in very poor conditions for very poor wages, and there's not much they can do about it because they're caught within the system. And in fact, I would say that there are sections of the British economy which are totally reliant now on those modern day slavery conditions to continue to actually trade. And that's a really concerning consequence. And there are social and economic consequences. The social consequences are significant. And I worry that the same is true down under as well, insofar that we know that there are people earning well below what they should be earning in Australia. And the businesses who do that say, well, that's the only way we can get by. But on the other hand, um, you know, they are actually breaking the rules.
The thing that gets me just from the social aspect, the social aspect of this is we basically, Western society basically is a giant pendulum swinging one way, left to right, again and again, between conservative and progressive, time and time again, across history. And for the longest time, for most of my life, it was swinging towards the left. It's swinging towards progressivism. Probably, some would say too far towards in that direction. You know, and now, we're in the sort of last maybe 5 years, we've started sort of pause, and now it's swinging back the other way. It's swinging back towards the right. It's swinging back towards conservatism. And in some ways, populist right wing conservatism, I would say, in a lot of ways. And we're only seeing that the beginning of that right now.
Mm.
This is the early stages of it. And if the early stages of it are majority support in a place like Britain for deporting legal migrants who came to Britain in relatively recent years, what is it going to look like in 5 years or 10 years? And what is it going to look like if economic times get even more challenging again, which is well and truly within the realm of possibility? Like, it is a very, very concerning future. And it bothers me immensely that this these scenarios are not being paid sufficient heed in Australia, that we're just running headlong into just whatever come what may.
Absolutely, and of course, the inflation story is not over, and we're seeing quite significant hikes on various fronts. One of the most interesting ones, of course, on the inflation story is the current view of what's happened with rental inflation. Trying to make sense of that is a it's a whole new story, isn't it?
Indeed, it is. Now, this chart was included in the recent RBA statement on monetary policy, and well, this illustrates one of the trends in Australian data that, it annoys me a lot. Because what you've got here is advertised rents as measured by CoreLogic versus the CPI rents from the ABS. And as you can see there, advertised rents absolutely took off, and then CPI rents also began to catch up, but have now begun to fall relatively precipitously. Except when you do the math, and even after you adjust for the impact of the increases to Commonwealth rent assistance, the gap is getting on for 15 percentage points between the two. The gap, if you use SQM's data instead, or Domain's data, the gap is more than 20 percentage points in terms of cumulative growth in rents versus cumulative growth in CPI rents since the just prior to the pandemic. And that, to me, is an absolutely striking divergence, because if we were to magically swap out CBA's data or DFA's data on rents, because they are both measurements of actual payable rents, whereas CoreLogic and SQM are measurements of asking rents, we would have seen in headline inflation significantly higher. You would have seen rent being given a higher weight in the CPI as well, and it would have likely resulted in either no rate cuts or potentially even higher interest rates to begin with. So I think that's just a rather interesting one. And I'm not seeing really any sign of a major convergence, shall we say, between CPI rents and between advertised rents, particularly as advertised rents show signs of reaccelerating.
Well, absolutely. Well, I've held the view for some time that there's a real big story here. Not that the mainstream want to cover it very much, but there is this gap between the advertised rents, which of course are the empty properties that are available for somebody to go and rent. And remember, of course, that that varies across the country, different rents in different places. And then the actual physical rent that people are paying, CPA measures it, I measure it, and both CBA and I are seeing much higher rates of rental inflation because the existing rents are being put up, and 10% increases are not unheard of in my data at the moment in some areas. And then people are really caught because they either have to just pay up, or they try to find somewhere else and join the 30 parties trying to look at the property down the road, and good luck with that. So there is a fundamental question here, and I have to come back to the view that the CPI numbers are pretty wobbly on a number of different bases, but the rental one is one that I think is really questionable. And from a data quality perspective, I'm not sure that I believe the official statistic on this.
Well, I mean, you're not the only one on that. I mean, Louis Christopher from SQM has been talking about the divergence between the two for quite some time now. I believe you talked about it on your show a couple of years ago. But it's just something that is so vital, and I think that it's not being if it's not being adequately captured, there's major issues for a lot of different people. Particularly renters,
Yep.
because they're not seeing they're not seeing their particular their quality of life. Sorry, they're not seeing their life their challenges reflected adequately in the data than compared with, say, someone with a mortgage, because it's a lot easier to quantify exactly what's going on with a mortgage, because you just ring up the banks and just be like, well, what's the data done, and what's the interest rate, etc., and just do a little bit of simple math. Whereas this is a lot more complex, and I think it does a disservice to renters to not adequately cover this. And I don't know. I feel like there's a major blind spot more broadly when it comes to the cost of rent and its actual impact on households. When I look at your data, I look at CBA's data, and it paints a completely different picture to some of these surveys that say, well, no, rents, that the proportion being spent on rent today isn't that dissimilar to prior to the pandemic. When you get out there and you ask the average person on the street, and they're like, it's a completely different galaxy, mate.
Absolutely. And interesting, there were some comments on the Hilda data about that, and suggesting that the story on rents is probably more aggressive, particularly for some particular household cohorts that have less ability to pay. So that was quite interesting. They talked about the proportion of people in financial difficulty, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the Hilda data is 2 years plus old, which doesn't help. We want more frequent data than that, more recent data than that. And as I mentioned earlier on, the Hilda data also underrepresents the cohorts that have come into the country relatively recently, which is important because in my data, it's the first generation migrants who actually record the highest level of mortgage stress, which is quite interesting, right? So people come in, trying to find somewhere, paying through the nose for it, and end up in financial difficulty almost immediately, which comes right back to our earlier conversation then about high migration as well. It's all linked.
It is, and to be completely honest with you, I find it I'm not going to go into this, too heavily again because it's something that we've discussed in the past. But I just think it's a little bit silly the way that we that basically if you take issue with the level of the migration intake, you're seen as anti-migrant when actually, as you say, some of the people being hit hardest by the challenging conditions are newly arrived migrants. So, let's just be clear on exactly what we're reaping and exactly what we're sowing in that particular vein.
Mhm. Yeah, and people perhaps who are thinking about migrating to Australia should do a little bit of work on understanding what it's like to be in Australia, and especially trying to get into the housing sector, for example, in the rental sector. And it's not necessarily easy. So just important little public service announcement there. Now, talking about public service announcements, there was an interesting piece of analysis done relating to climate change, and of course, all the discussion about climate change. And so, relevant piece of data that you've got here.
Yes, this poll was taken of ABC readers in 2019. Now, just a sort of, you know, qualifier. This was taken of ABC News readers. So obviously there is going to be a slight slant towards the viewpoints and the ideologies favoured by the ABC News base. Now, what exactly you believe that slant to be, I'll leave you to make up your own minds because I don't have the data to prove things one way or another. But there you go. What this chart shows is what level of annual financial commitment Australians would make in order to pay for climate change action. Now, this reflects another study done by the University of Chicago, which has been running theirs for a number of years, which basically says that Americans are very much in favor of climate change action conceptually. But once they have to start personally paying money, they tend to say, no, that's too much. And the amount of money they start to say, no, that's too much at a majority level is about $20 a month. For Australians, the ABC put this through their model, and they concluded that it was about $200 per year was the amount that Australians were willing to pay for climate change action. Now, this comes amidst the Albanese government's 62 to 70% emissions reduction plan by 2035. Now, this plan annoys me, not because I have any conceptual issue with action on climate change, but because it didn't come with any costings. It's just a case of, hey, figure it out. Now, so I put it through a couple of different AI models and asked, well, what's it going to cost the federal government? I then averaged that number and then divided it over the next 10 years by the total number of taxpayers. It came to a figure of $3,200 per taxpayer per year. Now, whether that is that right, I have no idea, because it obviously depends on what path you're going to take, and there was lots of different paths laid out in the plan. But that was what the model spat out. And $3,200 per year is a lot more than the $200 that people who were polled said that they were willing to pay. So I think that really just articulates just how vulnerable climate change action is politically to someone who's willing to rock the boat. Because for a long time now, since the sort of Tony Abbott left the building, so to speak, the Liberal Party has actually, relatively speaking, towed the line on climate change. They haven't rocked the boat too much. They haven't, run the Tony Abbott's, sort of scare campaign where the carbon tax is going to send the cost of a lamb roast up to $120 and all that sort of stuff. They've actually been relatively quiet on the issue, probably because they are relatively vulnerable in those inner city seats on this issue. But if they were to take the Andrew Hastie approach and push back on the government's targets and on net zero, I'm not necessarily convinced that that is a bad political long-term move. If they can make a case that this plan is going to cost Australians a fairly hefty chunk of change, because $3,200 a year in additional tax is a fairly sizable hit to the average household. that could be quite politically successful in the long run. Because the Liberals have not made climate change about the hip pocket since Abbott left, really. So I think that that is something that they could be relatively successful with. Now, personally, I'm an old school environmentalist. I would like to see action on things like deforestation and loss of biodiversity and not poisoning the planet to the point where we cause a complete cascade failure of the ecosystem. But I'm also well old enough and perhaps wise enough to know what this sort of thing actually looks like when it comes to politics.
Well, it is, of course, a political game, isn't it? And the story is that there isn't much below the waterline when it comes to what they're actually wanting to do, planning to do. And I don't think the consequences are fully understood. Mind you, the consequences of the higher rainfall, the bigger winds, etc., in terms of costs are huge. And you only have to look at recent events where people got flooded out and costs of insurance are rising. So I would argue that many households are already having to pay a lot more for the consequences of the non-action on climate change, which is something to sort of factor in. And I noticed the insurance premiums are still rising, not quite as much as they were in the latest CBI number. But there is a real gap between the high-level political narrative that we got from the government and the reality that's required to really take this seriously and do what's what. And remember, taxes are already at record levels. So what we're talking about is an additional impost through the tax system to cover the additional investment in the climate change story. And yeah, you're right. There is a political angle here for the opposition, I guess, if they could get their act together. But chances of they getting their act together at the moment, it's probably close to a zero as well, isn't it?
What net zero chance, though?
Exactly.
No, I think part of the problem is that climate change is a very abstract issue, and you've got the problem whereby, like, say hypothetically, Hasti ends up being leader, and we're heading into the 2020, what is it, the 2028 election campaign. If Hasti gets up there and says this is costing you $3,200 extra, now personally, I don't actually think that that's going to happen. I mean, in terms of the actual cost, because I don't think the government's going to be willing to pay it. I think it's all just lip service bull. But let's say that Hasti does run with that. You're paying an extra $3,200. Hasti pulls up a nice big chart, like the size of one of those giant checks that you get when you win the lotto in America, and it shows the fact that the increase in Indian coal production since Albo was elected is basically the size of the entirety of the Australian coal industry. It's gonna get pretty hard to continue to sell that to the average person in the street when you've got the developing world continuing to expand their usage of fossil fuels in aggregate terms, and you're asking Australians to then pay more to reduce our emissions. And because at the end of the day, on a even medium term time horizon, it's an abstraction because the developing world is going to keep pushing up emissions. Things are going to keep, in terms of the modeled impact, things are going to keep getting worse. So it's very difficult to sell that action to people paying more for things to get worse because other people are making them worse from a political perspective. So I think that it's very easy for the Australian left to say, oh, don't worry about it. The coalition are cooked on migration. Things are going to be fine. It's all good. All I can say is look at Canada. Canada abandoned its carbon tax not because not because the right did it, but because the left did it, because they were so concerned about the political impact. So I think that there's that vulnerability there on the issue of climate change for the left that can be exploited by the right, particularly in challenging economic times for households.
Yeah, well, we'll watch that with significant interest ahead. And, talking about significant interest, the next chart is absolutely stunning. the China story, which is just worth reflecting on, right? This is the story about the manufacturing trade surplus as a percentage of GDP. Oh, they're a bit busy, aren't they?
They are. Now, just for a little bit of fun, interesting stuff. Australia's manufacturing as a percentage of our entire GDP is 5%. Now, China's manufacturing trade surplus, this is every Chinese manufacturing export minus every import of a manufactured good into China. So as you can see, it's well above 10% of Chinese GDP. I actually ran the numbers on this a few months ago, and China actually runs the largest manufacturing trade surplus as a percentage of as a percentage of global GDP in the history of the world. Their manufacturing trade surplus today is significantly larger than the manufacturing trade surplus that got the US economy into so much trouble when it held the title of the world's factory in a time of economic crisis. And one you might be familiar with, it was in late 1929.
Oh, okay. That's one to watch then, isn't it?
Well, you see, that's the problem when you've got these engines of the global economy reliant on exporting their excess capacity into the world,
Yeah.
and then the world hits a speed bump, and the world economy hits a major speed bump. What happens to the capacity? And this is an interesting one for us here in Australia, because people can say, we're not exposed to that. We have the lowest level of manufacturing activity relative to GDP in the OECD. We are, effectively immune to the global manufacturing cycle. And in direct terms, yes, there is some truth to that. But indirectly, we're exposed to the global manufacturing cycle by our reliance on the Chinese economy, whereby if you factor in the all of the various cash flowing to the manufacturing activities, which is the building of machinery for manufacturing, the actual manufacturing of goods, the manufacturing of transport goods, which is ships, cars, buses, locomotives, you name it, you're talking about well in excess of 40% of China's steel capacity, which would be impacted by a downturn in the Chinese manufacturing sector. But wait, there's more. Now, if all of a sudden the Chinese government has to prop up its manufacturing sector, which it has just spent trillions upon trillions of dollars building and subsidizing, where is it going to pull the capital from? Oh, it's going to pull the capital from all those infrastructure projects and residential construction projects, which use, you guessed it, steel made with Australian coking coal and Australian iron ore. So basically, the moral of the story is if China's economy gets hit hard enough, it's dragging us down with it.
Absolutely. And we are very reliant on the China story for the other leg of the stool, housing being one, and the exports of minerals, particularly the other leg of the stool. And well, they could be a bit wobbly. And as we come to the end of the show, Tarric, there's one last little nugget here, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Yes, this one was an interesting one. I saw this chart on Twitter. Basically, it was a bunch of different search terms put through Google and Google search trends, and basically it tells you as a number balanced to 100 how close the current level of activity was to peak levels. Now, I got curious and I punched in a bunch of different terms, thinking, well, I wonder what sort of interesting trends I can find. So I put in the words bankruptcy lawyer, and oh boy, it recently hit an absolute all-time high. A level that is almost was actually over double what it was during the actual declared global financial crisis recession. So, yeah, I think that at a individual level, some Americans might be in trouble, but it's also worth noting that the US economy is increasingly less reliant on those on the lower socioeconomic rungs of society. because it is increasingly an economy for the affluent and by the affluent, with 10%, with the top 10% of Americans now accounting for half of all consumer consumption spending.
Yeah, and that's a killer stat, isn't it? And we're coming right back to the K shape and the fact that there are some doing very well and some not doing very well. Um, Unfortunately, that same trend is also true in the UK and certainly in Australia. I see it in my surveys too. And I do find it quite interesting that the political, momentum seems to be more aligned with those on the upside of the K rather than the downside of the K. And I think that's a pretty disgraceful commentary on the way that the political system is not currently working for the majority of ordinary people.
I concur, and I will just also just very briefly add to that I don't think that any of the populists, Trump, Farage, you name it, are really actually, what's the word, acting in the interest of the average person in the street, in the interest of Main Street, as they say in US politics, because, well, you look at the numbers and things are not getting better out there. They're getting worse. They're getting more divided. Trump celebrates pumping the stock market when all that's doing in effect is making the rich richer. It's not the poor who are, riding this particular wave. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess. And I think it's funny that people think of Trump as sort of like the end game, the final boss of right wing populism. Oh boy, he's just the beginning, my friend.
I'm afraid that you're right, Tarek. And I think over the next few years, as some of these things play out, we're going to see more contention between the different philosophies underlying it. In fact, I played a few older shows while I was actually on holiday last week, and I had Michael Hudson talking about the fact that the structure of the economy is owned by the wealthy, designed for the wealthy, at the expense of everybody else. There's nothing new about that. You can go right back and see it in Roman times and Greek times. It's always been the same. So the debt slavery might be different today, but it is still just as much in play. And of course, I had a show from Steve Keen when he was talking about the fact that actually it's the generation of credit, which is actually sustaining debt, which is actually developing the momentum in the economy, but it's not necessarily sustainable for a lot of people. So there's some really, really important principles here. And what we've been touching on today, I think, is the economy continues not to work well for the majority of people. And yet, for the few, everything's fine. It's always been thus. But for the majority, not so much.
Yes, and I agree. And I think the thing that we really need to look at as a society, both in Australia and around the world, is who are we fighting for?
Mm.
Who are we not who are we fighting for, but who are we standing for? Who are we standing with? Like I look at some of the people who give the government here in Australia their sort of unquestioning support, and it's so weird seeing people put out business lobby lines. Things like, oh, well, if we didn't have migration so high, there'd be shortages of workers. And it's like, so let's just be clear, okay? Let's just be clear about the trade-off being made. So you wanted workers because the business lobby demanded them, and now we've got this enormous rental crisis that's one of the worst in the world, and the rental crisis in the US ended 2.5 years ago, right? That's the choice that you're making. That's the choice that you're moralizing. And I just think people just need to take a bit of a cold, hard look at the situation and think about who they're really standing with and what they're standing for. Because I don't think it's, in a lot of cases, it's what they actually believe. I think it's just division and politics pushing people into different corners, not actually what they believe in their hearts.
Well, I've always held the view that, in a way, divide and conquer and misdirect are two of the levers. And those levers, if they're used, and they are being used at the moment, means that people are more and more confused and less able to, mount a serious response in a way that reduces their capacity to engage with some of these issues. Well, they're still struggling to pay the bills in the meantime. And that actually means that there's more potential for those in power to keep control. And, as Michael says in his show with me, they are never going to give it up because they are calling the shots.
Well, in the words of Iril and Carino from Children of June, deception is a legitimate tool of statecraft.
Nice way to finish, Tarric. Thank you so much for that. Very important conversation today, some important thoughts, and I hope we will be able to do it again soon. And the new setup there is working really well, so thanks for that.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Martin. Great to be here.
See you next time. Take care.